Hi everybody, welcome to our first lecture for this week. This lecture is on public sector providers of outdoor recreation. The image that you're looking at is of Saguaro National Park. Saguaro National Park is managed by the National Park Service, and it bookends the city of Tucson, which means it has a unit on the east side of Tucson and another unit on the west side of Tucson. I used to work at Saguaro National Park, and I love it there. And it is a perfect example of a public sector provider providing a setting in which to recreate. Okay, so we're going to talk about the interrelationships between providers, and we're going to do that by looking at a framework that really looks at the connection between them. So this will look familiar from your book. So there are service providers. So these are folks who provide outdoor outfitting and guiding, maps, instruction, program, information about outdoor recreation, right? All of these different things are services that entities provide that relate to outdoor recreation, right? So service providers is one. Second is setting providers. This is really kind of obvious, right? But what setting does outdoor recreation occur in? Is it a forest, a park, a river, wilderness, or refuge? It could be an urban park. It could be a privately owned mountain biking park. It could be a privately owned artificial whitewater park, like the one from a few weeks ago from Idaho, from Cascade, Idaho, Kelly's Water Park, right? So there are all sorts of different setting providers. They aren't all necessarily publicly owned, right? We can think about a private mountain biking park, a ski resort, that kind of stuff. Those are privately owned. The Nature Conservancy owns land where people recreate on. That's a nonprofit, right? So the setting, although often is owned by the public, isn't always. So there are equipment providers, right? So these are manufacturers of equipment, right? You can think of a bunch of different brands that sell a bunch of different kind of equipment. I'm not going to list any here, but you can just imagine how many brands are out there, how many manufacturers are out there creating outdoor recreation equipment. And then, of course, there are the retailers or the sellers of those equipment, so outdoor recreation stores. Think like REI, those types of places. And there's also local stores as well. But these are the equipment providers. And then there's the facility providers. So these are places like visitor centers, trails, campgrounds, hotels. So these are all different types of facilities that in some way facilitate outdoor recreation in various ways, right? So we have the service providers, setting providers, equipment providers, and facility providers, all kind of working together to help to facilitate a variety of outdoor recreation opportunities in a variety of places, using a variety of services, a variety of settings, a variety of equipment, and a variety of facilities, right? So outdoor recreation is a really wide field, and you can imagine the diversity and breadth of these different types of providers kind of all feeding into outdoor recreation opportunities. So this is a really important framework to really understand the way that these different providers work together to create and to facilitate outdoor recreation opportunities. Okay, so let's talk about the federal government. Let's talk about the federal providing agencies. This is the federal government, right? So the federal government, there are different kinds of philosophies, kind of orientations, approaches to management that we might kind of know a little bit about, but let's articulate them here so we're all kind of on the same page as to what they do. Right, so there are entities like the National Park Service, parts of the Forest Service, parts of the BLM that do preservation. So what preservation is basically preserving landscapes for people to experience them in a similar way over time, right? So these landscapes are unimpaired. And really interesting and kind of problematic and challenging note about what preservation means today is, today we have the context of climate change. We have extreme fires. We have invasive species. We have all these different things that are going to profoundly affect how landscapes look. And in order to preserve those landscapes in the exact same way, managers really have to manipulate the biophysical environment to do that. And the social environment too, right? They have to manipulate visitor behavior, what people are doing, that kind of stuff. But that, brings up this really interesting question as to whether or not we're preserving what landscapes look like, or if we're preserving natural processes, or if we're preserving ecological processes from happening, right? So this question is really interesting as to whether or not we want to take a hands-off approach, and just let nature run its course, let whatever happens in nature happen, right? As long as it doesn't put people and property at risk, I think is the philosophy. Or do we really consciously manipulate environments to have them look the way that they did, let's just say, pre-European colonization of the continent, right? So these are really interesting questions that don't really have right answers, but these are the kind of debates that are happening right now in the preservation side of things. So conservation, right? So conservation is basically the sustainable or wise use of resources. So this picture is from the Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota. This is a silvicultural kind of project in which they are trying to, manage this timber landscape for the long term, so that they can get a good profitable yield out of this landscape over time, in a sustainable way. So that's kind of conservation. Exploitation is kind of more focused on short-term gains, right? So this is in Utah, and it's exploitation again. It's focused on extractive industries that don't really have long-term kind of conservation sustainability plans for a particular resource or a particular place, right? And the federal agencies, they do all of these different things. We're not going to say whether or not these are good or bad, right? I want to kind of avoid this kind of normative, prescriptive language, and I just want to help us describe them and get on the same page about the language that we can use. Okay, so the Forest Service, the United States Forest Service. So their mission is to ensure for the present and future generations the long-term health, diversity, and productivity of the land, right? So Forest Service is mostly a conservation entity or agency. They do sustainable timber operations, but they also, because they manage a large part of the National Wilderness Preservation System, they do preservation too, right? Because they've got these wilderness areas that people recreate on. You can't cut down trees there. You can't do mining within wilderness areas. There's a variety of things, a variety of policies within the Wilderness Act that kind of derive from the Wilderness Act that really lead agencies to preserve these places. And important to note, we're going to talk about all the agencies that are responsible for wilderness preservation today, but the Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all of those have wilderness areas in them. So all of those are going to kind of have this preservation aspect of it. Not just because of the wilderness areas, but because wilderness areas are in them, they all kind of have that preservation aspect. So a really important law for the Forest Service is this Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960. And what this did is it really clarified the Forest Service as serving these multiple but sometimes conflicting purposes, right? So Forest Service forests need to provide for multiple uses, right? So recreation, timber, resource extraction, all these different things. So and you can imagine that sometimes these things might conflict with one another, and that's what makes the Forest Service such an interesting agency, because it has this multiple use focus, and it's a fascinating agency that has this kind of dual mandate, or this multiple mandate to do all these different things, and you can see how interesting and challenging it would be to work with the Forest Service. It's a really cool agency. So the primary focus that they have on their resources and programs, so they have this national forest system, right? So these are the forests that, you probably have heard of, right? So the Tahoe National Forest, the Mendocino, the Modoc, Willamette, Deschutes, Superior National Forests. There's a lot of different national forests across the country, and in Puerto Rico as well. So that's kind of the setting in which recreation occurs. It's important to note that the Forest Service has a really hierarchical structure. So a lot of the buildings you might see when you're out in the forests, like the offices, might be the district level office. But then there's also a forest level, which, district level is the lowest kind of part of the hierarchy, where there's multiple districts within one forest. So, for instance, where I used to work, the Willamette National Forest had multiple districts. One was the McKenzie River Ranger District where I worked, but it also had the Detroit Ranger District, and other one as well. And then above the forest level is the regional level. There's 9 regions of the Forest Service across the U.S. And then there's the national level, which is based in Washington, D.C., or the Washington office. So the Forest Service also has a pretty robust research and development program. They've got research stations kind of all across the country where they do research on forestry practices, outdoor recreation, ecology, just all the different kinds of research that would be relevant to managing a forest. A really big focus now, obviously, perhaps, is wildfire, climate change, invasive species, that kind of stuff. And also there's a big interest in sustainable recreation too. So the Forest Service also provides guidance to state and private foresters to promote best management practices and other things like that. So here's a map of the National Forest Service units across the country. So the ones in yellow are national grasslands, and the ones in green are forests. As you can see, most of the forest land is in the western United States, although there's some kind of where I live in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and Michigan. And then we've got some in the Appalachian Mountains and Arkansas and Missouri too. And then, like I said, you can't really see it very well in this picture, but there's El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico. Alaska has a lot of land as well too. That's managed by the National Forest. So National Forest, right, so I mentioned this kind of in the last slide, but they've got national grasslands. They have actual forests, so this is the Middle Fork Ranger Station and the Willamette National Forest. But they also manage, scenic and wild rivers and a variety of other sites and settings that are articulated in the textbook that you can take a look at if you're interested in that. So that's the National Forest Service. Okay, so the National Park Service. All right, its mission is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And the Organic Act, which is kind of the enabling legislation of the Park Service, is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment in the same manner, and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So a couple of really important notes here is this idea of unimpaired. It's in the mission and it's in the Organic Act too. So I think the fundamental question that the National Park Service is facing as an organization, as a agency that focuses on preservation, is how do we preserve these landscapes while also letting people use and enjoy these landscapes, and how do we inspire people on these landscapes if there are so many people who might be impacting the biophysical system, like the ecosystems, but also the social system, right? So crowding and that kind of stuff. So the fundamental question for the Park Service really is, how do we facilitate visitor use while preserving in an unimpaired way those systems, those social ecological systems? And there's a whole field of study kind of around this, which is the field of recreation ecology. And recreation ecologists, what they do is they study recreational impacts to the biophysical and social environments of parks and protected areas. And they also study the effectiveness of management strategies to help mitigate some of those impacts. And, it's a really important field. There's a class in our program, RHPM 446, that I teach, that we talk about that. So that's kind of like the core challenge of the Park Service, is this dual mandate to provide enjoyment and experience in places while also leaving them unimpaired. And you can imagine, like, this is a challenging dual mandate to fulfill. So here are the the Park Service lands in the U.S. You can see there's a lot in Alaska. Alaska's big, and there's a lot of acreage there. Again, we see most of these areas are in the West. California has quite a bit, unsurprising, because California has such beautiful, kind of aesthetically pleasing landscapes. But also in the east there are national trails and national parks. Where I live, there's a national park called Voyageurs National Park and Isle Royale in the middle of Lake Superior, which is really cool and has really awesome studies that have been going on it for a long time about moose and wolves. Hawaii's got some. American Samoa and Guam also have some National Park Service units as well, right? So again, mostly in the West and Alaska, but again, spread out throughout the country. And there are lots of different types of National Park Service units. It's not just these big crown jewel national parks, right? So there are national recreation areas, national historic sites, national battlefields. There's national highways, scenic byways, that kind of stuff. And of course, we have national parks too. If you want a list of all the different kinds of National Park Service units, check out chapter 6 in the book. It really clearly articulates what all the different types of units that the National Park Service manages. Okay, so Bureau of Land Management. So this mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of the present and future generations. So Bureau of Land Management is really interesting. If you remember from the book, basically all the land that the Bureau of Land Management manages is leftover land from when the U.S. government gave away that land to settlers in the West. And what's really interesting about the Bureau of Land Management is that it has some obvious exploitation, right? There's oil, there's gas extraction, there's conservation, they've got timber operations, right? And they also have preservation of wilderness areas, of cultural sites, that kind of stuff. And again, all of the BLM land is really these leftover public domain lands that we didn't really know what to do with. So we had them put in an agency to manage in these various kind of interesting ways. So to give you an idea of where all the BLM lands are, this map doesn't even show the eastern U.S. because there's no BLM lands in the eastern U.S. because the public domain had to do with the West. But you can really see that Nevada has a ton of BLM lands. The deserts of California and western Arizona have a lot. Utah has a lot. Idaho. But really all the yellow is where BLM lands are. This isn't the best map in the world, but there's light yellow and dark yellow. Kind of like a brownish yellow color. All the brownish yellow, dark yellow colors are wilderness study areas, which are basically managed as wilderness areas, right? So these are the areas that the BLM is kind of tasked to preserve, right? Whereas the other lands, there might be exploitation and conservation, but there also is preservation on those non-dark lands as well. But it is important to note that a lot of different wilderness areas in the West are part of the BLM. Okay. So some examples of things that the BLM does, right? So again, here's a wilderness in New Mexico. They do timber sales and sustainable timber operations. They extract energy and minerals through mining and a variety of things. And they also preserve cultural resources too. So it's a really fascinating agency that I think has been overlooked in a lot of ways. This is just my personal opinion. But has been overlooked in a lot of ways, and they play a really important role in managing the landscape in the West. And you can just imagine that map and how many lands, how much land is managed by the BLM, and it's pretty astounding how much land in the West is still under the BLM's jurisdiction, right? So they're obviously a really important agency, and I think that as use pressures increase on national park sites and Forest Service sites, we might see some overflow into some of these lesser used, lesser known BLM sites. And that's kind of why I think it's an exciting agency to think about today. Okay, so the Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, so its mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance the fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is primarily a preservation agency, but also there's conservation, right? So it's preservation because it really is trying to protect endangered species and protect habitats, protect migratory bird habitat as well. But they have fish hatcheries, and other kinds of things that they manage, which I think fall under this conservation kind of ethos. Right, so some of the things that they do, I kind of got at it a second ago, but they manage federal wildlife refuges and fish hatcheries. They try to protect and increase populations of threatened and endangered species. Thinking about the Endangered Species Act. They manage the nation's migratory bird program, and they also study federal water development projects. But they also study a variety of other things too, like the effects of climate change, let's say, on habitats, the effects of people on habitats, how to understand visitor behavior in these places. They work in conjunction with the Forest Service. They sometimes work in conjunction with like the U.S. Geological Survey to do research. But again, this is a really interesting agency. They've got a bunch of places all across the country. There's a lot in California. There's a lot on the West Coast in general. A ton in North Dakota because of the migratory birds are important here. Some in Minnesota. I grew up right next to one in Minneapolis. So there's just a variety of different places that's the Fish and Wildlife Service manages across the country. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these super duper in depth, but there are federal water project agencies that all kind of do similar things, and they have reservoirs, and people boat and swim and do water recreation on them. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I'm just going to read the missions of these places, but U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they provide quality, responsive engineering services to the nation building. So this is planning, designing, building, and operating water resources and other civic works projects. Again, like we can think of reservoirs, we can think of places like that provide outdoor recreation. Bureau of Reclamation, kind of similar, right? They manage, develop, and protect water and related resources in an environmentally and economically sound manner in the interest of the American public, right? So there's lots of water resources that the Bureau of Reclamation has that people recreate on. I should note that most of the sites that the Army Corps of Engineers manages are kind of in the East and the Midwest, and then the Bureau of Reclamation is predominantly a Western agency, so a Western U.S. agency. The last is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is this interesting kind of quasi-private, public, kind of corporate governmental entity that its mission is to achieve excellence in public service for the good and the people of the Tennessee Valley, so this is the Eastern U.S., by supporting sustainable economic development, supplying affordable, reliable power, and managing a thriving river system. So again, they provide outdoor recreation settings in the East, predominantly for water-based recreation. It's important to note that the Tennessee Valley Authority started in the 30s during the Great Depression to try to promote economic development in the Tennessee Valley area. So, another pretty important agency, maybe less so, definitely less so in the West because it's not in the West. But I think if we're trying to understand the U.S. as a whole, it's a really important agency that does work specifically in water-based recreation. So I don't want to discount the importance of regional, county, and municipal agencies by lumping them all together and not spending a lot of time on them. But lots of agencies like the East Bay Regional Park District, Three Rivers Park District in Minneapolis, right? So these are regional districts that manage a variety of sites. You can think of Lane County Parks, which is in Oregon, Santa Clara County Parks in California. Again, this is a county system. And then there's city parks too. So San Francisco Recreation and Park, Chico Recreation Park District, Portland as well. I didn't even talk about this, but there's a big state park systems as well across the U.S. And, state parks play a pretty similar role to, I would say, the, Forest Service and Park Service, and maybe some of the other federal agencies, but they just work on the state level. And with state parks, it's really important to note that, a lot of people, and this goes with the regional, county, and municipal agencies too. That's why I'm kind of lumping all of these together. So state, regional, county, and municipal together. a lot of people visit these places on a daily basis. And these places are kind of the front lines where a lot of people, especially in urban areas, experience parks and outdoor recreation. And they're really places that provide settings for those things. And they are very, very important. They're very understudied. I think that they're, this again, the personal opinion, I think that they're often unappreciated for the role that they play in facilitating, relationships between people in the natural world. But I do think that, especially some of the urban parks, there's more research steam kind of going behind some work in those kinds of parks, because people are really becoming more and more interested in urban parks and how to design them in ways that people want, and also design them in ways to protect the biophysical environment in the best way that they possibly can. Okay, so those those are some examples of regional, county, and municipal agencies. Remember that there are state park systems too, and that the state parks do a variety of things. But I hope with this lecture, I just kind of gave you an overview of what the federal agencies do, what state parks do, and what these regional, county, and municipal agencies kind of do. Remember, kind of like everything in life, all of this is very context dependent. And it's going to differ from place to place, their management strategies, that kind of stuff. But all these public sector providers are providing settings for outdoor recreation to occur in. So thank you.